Welcome to the podcast of the Public Education Foundation.
I'm Zhan Okuda-Lim, Resident Fellow with the Leadership Institute of Nevada. I'm here today with our Senior Founding Fellow of the Leadership Institute and Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Rick Hess. Hey, Rick, it's great to have you on the podcast again for Season 2.
Hey, good to be here, pal.
So, Rick, you're spending some time with our Teacher Leader Academy and Executive Leadership Academy this week talking about what it means to be a cage-busting leader and to be a cage-busting teacher. When you were writing the cage-busting leadership and the cage-busting teacher, what do you mean by cage-busting, and what did you want to convey to the intended readers of your books?
Sure. You know, one of the things I started noticing years and years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, was that when I would interact with superintendents, with principals, with state leaders, they were full of thoughtful diagnoses of the problems they saw and interesting ways of thinking differently about how you tackle them. How do you use staff differently? How do you hire different kinds of people in the job? How do you think differently about what teachers' roles are and what they do, about the use of technology? Then when I would visit these folks in their jobs, and I would observe them, when I would interview them, when I would consult with them, they would invariably be much less interesting than they were when they'd been talking about it. And it struck me over time that it wasn't because they had reached measured decisions that the things they thought might make sense wouldn't work. It was frequently because they told me general counsel told them it wasn't contractually permissible, or it was not an allowable use of Title I or Title II funds, or the state had determined that it was not an acceptable staffing configuration for blah, blah. And I kept hearing these things that you couldn't do. And what was striking to me was that every so often I would go to another place where people would be doing the same thing I've been told you couldn't do. What became clear to me over time was that it wasn't that you couldn't do these. More than half the time, I've concluded that you actually can do the things they had in mind, but that there is there's a set of urban myths about what you can't do in schools and school systems that get in the way, that people had once been told by a mentor, you can't do this, and it had gotten stuck in their heads, that they had never seen it done, that attorneys in school districts who are obviously risk averse often err on the side of just saying you can't do that without actually knowing what you can or can't do, because it's easier. And so what I saw all of these false negatives doing was creating a cage in which leaders thought they were much less free to solve problems for kids, much less free to spend dollars and use staff in more promising ways, much less free to do their jobs than they thought. And what they had done essentially was create cages of their own design. They had imagined cages where they needn't be. And so cage-busting leadership was really an attempt to try to give these leaders an understanding of rules, of regulations, of policy, of how do you think about what's allowed and not allowed, of how do you wrestle with these issues in a way that they would much more often do the things which they thought were best for kids, not the things which they mistakenly thought they were only allowed to do.
Mm-hmm. And then in your time with our Teacher Leader Academy, you shared a bit about how in writing the cage-busting teacher, when you were writing cage-busting leadership, these were the topics that you heard from principals, superintendents, folks at a school or system level. But in chatting with teachers, you heard a different tone. Tell us about that.
Sure. When cage-busting leadership came out, it gave me the opportunity to go around the country and talk to a lot of conferences and convenings of leaders and such. And there would invariably be some teachers in the back of the room, a teacher of the year here, a union president there. And what was funny was they came up frequently and they'd say, well, hey, I like the way you're talking about it. That resonates, this feeling caged, except that everything you said about what to do about it is totally irrelevant to my life. And at first, I had trouble kind of understanding exactly what was going on, but they were right. The things I'm talking about for principals, for superintendents, are about understanding what you can do and can't do with federal title funds, understanding how do you speak to the State Department of Education to clarify what they're okay with in terms of school improvement plans. These are things that teachers don't spend much time worrying about. What teachers actually get frustrated by is bell schedules that don't make any sense, announcements that interfere with class instruction, a lack of discipline across the school that bleeds over to their classroom, assistant principals who don't actually effectively support them when they're trying to deal with incidents of misbehavior. And teachers wanted to know, all right, well, when I've got these frustrations, what do I do? And it turns out, I think, that the teachers have a very different set of tools than principals do. Teachers have strength in numbers. Teachers have the ability to shape school cultures. Teachers have the ability to create the kinds of learning environments that they want by talking to administrators in productive ways, by pointing out opportunities to change the way schools go about announcements and bell schedules and approaching discipline. But teachers have too often either felt ignored or tuned out or frustrated by what they've done to date. And so they either don't engage in this stuff constructively, either they just lash out, or they just batten down, kind of close their door and tell each other this too shall pass, all of which winds up leaving them stuck in school cultures that they don't necessarily think let them do their best work.
Yeah. One of the topics that you discuss with our teacher leaders and with our executive leaders is this idea of little p policy and big P policy, right? When we're talking about capital P policy, we're looking at statutes, regulations, protocols that have the force of law or could be enforced in court ultimately. But oftentimes you have these little p policies, right? Tell us more about that and your advice for educators on navigating how to overcome little p policies if those are barriers to student success.
Sure. There's laws that are on the books. The Every Student Succeeds Act requires every state to administer tests in grades 3 through 8 in reading and math, and again in high school. In order to change that, you've got to go to Washington, you got to get Congress to rewrite the law. That's a big P policy.
And
That's
we just went through reauthorization of that just a couple of years ago. So,
and there's stuff on the books in Carson City. There are state laws regarding things like teacher evaluation or staffing requirements. To change these, you may have to go to Carson City and actually get the legislature to change them. That's a heavy lift. But it turns out that most of the stuff that teachers or even school leaders interact with on a daily basis is much more a little p policy. It's not codified in state or federal law. It is something that the State Department of Education did by way of interpreting a law. It's something that the school board put in place, and therefore the school board can reverse. Very frequently, it's simply something that the superintendent's team has adopted or the superintendent's team has left in place from a previous administration. This deals with everything from professional learning communities to how students are transported to school, to what's available in terms of online learning opportunities. Any number of things that raise questions in terms of how schools go about their business are actually pretty darn changeable, but we're so used to being unclear, to it being ambiguous, to folks telling us, hey, it's out of my hands because it's easier than explaining why they're doing it, that we have created this culture in which educators often feel like they have little control over the routines and the cultures of their school, even when they do.
Mm-hmm. And when we're looking at educators who are in a school or in a district or in a system who want to make a change that might affect or require changing a little p sort of policy, how do educators go about making that sort of change within this framework of being a cage-busting educator?
The first thing is to actually understand what the problem is you're trying to solve. It's easy to run around saying, we need more of this, we ought to do that. Problem is, we get excited. We go to ASCD and we see a presentation. We go, that sounds awesome. It's often disconnected from what we're actually trying to do in our schools and classrooms, which is why teachers feel like so many ways reform wash over them. So rather than starting with, we need to do this, you start with, let's get clear about what the actual problem is. Turns out that's actually much harder than you would think because it's not the way we usually talk about it. So what is it? Is it time is being spent in unhelpful ways? Is these requirements are getting in the way of me organizing students in a more useful fashion? Is it that the dollars being spent on that are actually not helping and could be reallocated to fund this? What is the actual problem? Once we're clear on that, well, what are we thinking about by way of what we might do? What can be done? And then it's useful to think about, all right, well, what's in the way? What would make this hard to do? What would make the people who I have to convince not be inclined to say yes? If you can do those things, if you can clarify what the problem is, you can offer a useful solution, you can get these people on board with you, it turns out that a lot of things that feel unchangeable actually turn out to be changeable.
And one of the things that you've explored with our Teacher Leader Academy participants is this idea of time and money, and how can teachers, schools, school systems be more efficient with time and money. Share with us what you shared with the teacher leaders on how they can use that framework to make an argument for improvements in something going on at school or in the school system.
Sure. I mean, one of the big problems is that if you're in a classroom or if you're a school leader, you have a lot of knowledge about what happens in your school that you take for granted. You know, these people are doing this and those people aren't doing that. And you just assume that other people are going to trust you when you say this, but they're not. Other people see lots of other schools. They see people behaving in different ways. So what you need is a way of explaining what's going on. You need language that you can share with people who don't have your familiarity with your school. One way to do this is to try to think in terms of what translates from a practitioner's hat to an administrator's hat, from a school hat to the perspective of somebody who has to govern a system, much less write policy for a state. Well, two of the easiest things to translate into are time. How much time is this taking? How much time is this taking away from student learning? How much time does this involve the trained professional not actually supporting kids' instruction? And money. How much does this cost? How much money are we spending on this rather than that? What might we do with this money? If you show up and you can talk about the time that's being spent, the money that's being spent, what happens is that teachers are now able to put their frustrations into language which can be understood by people who might not have their visibility into what's happening in the hallways, in the corridors of their school.
It brings to mind some alumni from our leadership academies who've worked on improvements to the educator evaluation system here in Nevada. And this is something you followed the last couple of years as well in your own work. But how in the last couple of years, educators were saying we're spending a lot of time on paperwork. We're doing all this paperwork for evaluations, and it's not helping teachers improve their practice. It's not helping principals become better principals. But part of what inspired changes to statute in moving the state now towards an electronic platform for this were alumni from our leadership programs who, doing some survey research, helped quantify what that meant. Instead of saying we're spending a lot of time, saying principals on average are spending X number of hours, X number of working days per school year simply doing paperwork for this evaluation system, and here's how much on a hourly basis that's costing, when principals and teachers could be doing other work to improve their practice and help student achievement.
You know, that's exactly right. I mean, if I remember right, that grew out of one of the Institute's capstones.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly right, right? If you just say, hey, these teacher evaluations take a lot of time, legislators say, well, too bad. You guys should have been doing this. We have to make you do your jobs. And that's a dead-end conversation. On the other hand, if you say, hey, I get it. Teachers should be evaluated, but there's really useful parts, which are the interaction, the pre-conversation,
coaching,
the coaching that goes with it. But what's going on is after all of that, at the end of the year, a high school principal, I think it was about 150 hours of time, is being spent on paperwork. With an 8-hour day, that's like 19 business days are being spent on nothing but formalizing state reporting paperwork at the end of the year. That's insane. And I think what happened when they documented this was legislators were willing to say, we like teacher evaluation, but this is insane, and say, are there ways that we can actually help solve this problem? So again, by clarifying the problem, by putting forward a sensible, workable solution, by taking seriously kind of the legislator concerns, it's possible to solve things that otherwise can just feel like, oh my gosh, here's one more ridiculous bureaucratic exercise.
And that's one of the key through lines through your work and through what you're coaching the Leadership Academy participants on is the importance of remembering that everybody is, as you would say, the hero of their own story. And it's important to put yourself in the shoes of others who you have to convince, who might be in that decision-making role, and trying to understand where are they coming from, because that's part of how educators can figure out what cage they might be in, bust out of that, and ultimately make a change that's good for the profession and good for students. Hey, Rick, thanks so much for taking time to join us on season 2 of our podcast, and always great to have you here in town.
Hey, great to be here.